Thank you so much for joining us once again with a brand new guest, and that is Jeff Younger from across the pond. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure to be here, Peter.
Great to have you. And any recommendation from Sam Sorbo is always worth having. So
She's the best.
Call out to Sam Sorbo and thank you for making the connection. I wasn't aware of the work you've done, Jeff, and delving into the fantastic work you've done in campaigning against the trans push, especially, and we'll get on to that. But people can follow you at Jeff Younger Show on Twitter or X, and of course jeffyounger.substack.com. Make sure and check that out. And if you like Jeff by the end, you may even want to become a paid subscriber. So I will leave that to you to make that judgment. Now, maybe your background, Jeff, before we get on to the topic. What's you're there over in Texas. What's your background?
Well, I have what I would call a typical Silicon Valley sort of career trajectory. It's funny when you ask an American, tell me your background, we always start with our work. It's one of the big differences between us and Europeans. But I think my friends in the UK do the same thing. It must be an Anglo thing. I went into the Marine Corps when I was a young man. When I came out of the Marine Corps, I knew how to program because I had done programming in the Marine Corps. And I began to work with mathematicians in the oil industry doing optimization systems for oil refineries and pipeline networks and things like that. And I got highly involved in operations research, and that led me into applied mathematics, which I did for years until I was 35. I was living in Hong Kong when I was 35. My father had 2 heart attacks, and I had to return to the United States. And I came to Dallas, Texas to take care of him to the end of his life. I got a letter from the Marine Corps when I was in Dallas saying that I was going to lose all my educational benefits because they expire. So I went to school at the University of Dallas, where I began studying linguistics and philosophy. Linguistics took me into the study of mathematical logic and back into mathematics. And from there, I had a kind of spiritual journey. I went from being an atheist to being an Orthodox Christian. And that was an important part of a shift in my worldview. And I married in 2010 and had 2 children. But a little bit before my son was 2 years old, my then wife began to try to transition one of my twin boys to a girl. And that set up a huge controversy in the state of Texas. Eventually, I was able to, it took me 6 years and hundreds of thousands of my own dollars of my own money. I was finally able to get a law passed in Texas banning these barbaric procedures on children. But my ex-wife has the courts backing her and the big donor class in America backing her. She was able to move my child to California. And I'm now in a court in California where I will go to trial on the 28th. If I lose that trial, my son will be castrated in November.
Wow. It's a huge issue and one that no parent expects. And we've had a number of people on talking about the trans agenda. And of course, we have had the Tavistock Clinic, and the UK and the Netherlands have been the world leaders in some crazy way of pushing this. But tell me, you were this happens, and then you go public. What were the first steps? Obviously, you try and reason with someone. You try and reason with your wife and try and work this out. And then there became a point, I guess, where you realized actually reason wasn't getting you anywhere.
Well, what I discovered was massive institutional corruption in the court systems and in the legislature of Texas, and all the way up to the governor of Texas. Let me just describe it simply. It took me, almost a decade to figure this out. So the Republican Party, which is largely thought of as the conservative party in America, has a kind of civil war that's going on inside of it. The Republican Party donor class are Northeastern liberals. They're New York. Yeah, in Texas we would call them Yankees, and we would say it exactly in that tone. So they're Northeastern Yankees who fund the entire Republican Party. And they're far left liberals. They're liberals and they're far left. They're woke. And then you have the voting base of the Republican Party, which is well, in the UK would be probably considered far right. I mean, center right. Center right in the United States is basically a Democrat here. So you have a far right electorate, a voting base, and a far left donor class. And so there's a war that goes on between them. And what happened is the case of my son in Texas family courts, kind of like in a rugby match. You have the offsides rules in rugby, unlike American football, so that all the action funnels towards the guy with the ball because of the offsides rule. Since I was one of the first cases in America, the donor class zeroed in on my case to make legal precedent, and the conservative electorate zeroed in on my case as one that had to be won. And in the case of my son, the liberal donor class clearly has won.
So what date was this, and why was your case high profile? Was this something fairly new? I mean, what kind of dates were these?
So it's 2010. In 2012, when my son was 2, she began to transition him to a girl. My ex-wife is a pediatrician, a physician, and she used her connections with, psychologists and to push me out of my own home. I lived a mile from my children. And the difference between me and some of these other cases is really just simply this. In family court, I think it's true in the UK as well, parents are put under gag orders, so they can't speak about their case. Well, I live in the state of Texas, and the state of Texas has better protections for free speech than even America's First Amendment. So I was put under an incredibly unconstitutional gag order, which actually makes this very podcast illegal in the state of Texas. It bans me from speaking on political topics for life. Wow. So I'm not allowed to speak about transgenderism, cisgender, gender dysphoria, any of this stuff. And I'm banned permanently from all social media. I'm not allowed to write newspaper articles. I'm not allowed to do interviews. It's completely unconstitutional. So I'm just the kind of guy that I decided in my life as a young man that I'm never going to follow illegal mandates from the government. So I was willing to speak out where I think other parents were not willing to do so. Also, I had connections with the Texas government and was able to lobby for laws, which a lot of people don't have the time or the money to do.
I've talked to, there are a whole lot of areas I want to unpack here and understand, because I think your story is a warning to yes. many individuals and many parents. But the family court system, certainly in the UK, you're right, it is a closed box. Yes. There's very little access to what happens. And I've talked to many who have custody issues, and they go through the family courts, and it is the most horrendous experience that I've ever heard of. Is it the same in the States, where it's a closed system and there's very little understanding of what happens behind those closed doors?
Yes. It's something that it's amazing that the electorate doesn't know more about family court. It is really the nexus for the reason that we don't have family formation anymore. Yeah. It's family courts and the laws that they interpret and govern marriage under. So yeah, they're closed. In my case, they've taken the unprecedented step of actually sealing my case, which there is no constitutional precedent for. But they are terrified of the facts of family courts. If the general public knew what happened in family courts in the UK and the United States, there really would be sense, because it is a system predicated on the abuse of children. It is the institutional abuse of children. It is also, in many ways, the enslavement of fathers. For example, one of the issues in my case is I'm required to pay medical child support. So if my child has a medical procedure, I have to pay for half of it. Well, I'm an Orthodox Christian. I can't pay for any amount of money towards the castration of my son. I can't do that. So my future lies in a Texas prison. I will be going to prison eventually for non-payment of child support.
Okay, I want to pick up on the spiritual side on you as a Christian, but first of all, the political side. Again, this is an issue in the UK that the Conservatives are so afraid of, and they don't want to get engaged. And of course, you've got a massive trans lobby and full-on LGBT lobby, and so which is well funded, and forces the agenda and the media slot into assisting that side. But what is the situation then politically? Whenever you begun to engage with lawmakers, what was the response that you had?
So the first legislative session that I attended, they threw me out of the legislature. They were scared of the issue and literally had me thrown out of the legislature, which is illegal in Texas. The second session, I went armed. So in Texas, you can carry guns in the Texas legislature. They were not able to throw me out. They weren't able to risk it. So one of the advantages of having a Second Amendment is that the government fears you as much as you fear the government. Yeah. So the second session, a huge full court press from the Texas House especially came into play, and they tanked the bill. They didn't consider it in committee. It didn't make it out. And a tremendous amount of money was spent on that. And at that time, a big demonization campaign began against me in the media. The third session, we made it through committee. And the reason we made it through committee, I'm just going to tell you, is I gave donations to key people. I mean, that's how the world works. And we got it through committee. The other thing I did is I went public and embarrassed a number of public officials.
Great.
And I name names. I don't have a problem naming people's names. We don't have the libel laws that you have there. Truth is an absolute defense against libel in America. And I name names if it's true, and I have a legislative record. I will name names, and I'll take it everywhere. I also created a huge movement in the rural parts of Texas. The basic idea was, if I can get, these are small counties where if I can just move 300 votes, I can switch a House seat in the Texas legislature. And I organized those people. They actually had to put in a new phone trunk into the Texas Capitol because I kept shutting down their phones. At one point, the Speaker of the House was recording over 300 lobbyists a day on my bill. But that's what it took to finally get it passed in the fourth session. So it took me that long to get this done. And what is the origin of this resistance? You would think, my goodness, these are conservative Christian Republicans in the House. What's going on? And what it amounts to is the liberal donor class in the Northeast, these New York liberals, particularly Paul Singer, just doesn't want these transgender bills passed. People don't realize the transgender movement in the United States was started and founded by Republicans, not by Democrats. It was founded by the Republican donor class. The Human Rights Campaign, the yellow equal sign, it's the most powerful LGBT lobby group in the world. That guy is the largest donor to the Republican Party. And he controls much of the media. He has what I would call an actual propaganda network in the media, in America at least. And so that's what I was actually fighting. And eventually I realized, once I got to California, there was an email I have a federal case as well as a state case. There was an email that was sent to me where they accidentally put some of the lawyers' names in the CC field instead of the BCC field. And it was links to lawyers in a number of Paul Singer funded foundations. So what I've actually been fighting is a coalition of well-funded foundations that have been run by large Republican donors. And that's why Republicans are loath to pass these bills. And it's why conservatives in the UK are loath to pass these bills. Their donors are fundamentally left-wing.
I mean, people would think Texas, red state, all good. And I know it's very different when you break it down at the local level, and I get that, but that's the prevailing understanding. But what you're saying is, initially you could not find Republican legislatures who were ideologically aligned to the issue that you raised.
Impossible. Even today, I can't. So, for example, the bill that I authored and was pushing actually classified these procedures on children as felony child sexual abuse, which in the state of Texas would get you life in prison, and under laws that are being proposed now would get you the death penalty. So that would completely prevent parents from taking their children outside of the state to get these procedures done. Because, you can't take your child to Thailand and abuse them and then come back to Texas. If you do that, Texas is going to put you in jail for the rest of your life. It's just that simple. But the Republicans pulled those 3 sentences that classified it as felony child sexual abuse out of the bill, specifically to introduce a loophole. And so this is basically how it works in the Republican Party, and I'm pretty sure this is how it works in the UK. You have a liberal donor class, you have a fairly right-wing electorate. How does an elected official split this difference? What they do is they pass bills that seem conservative, right? In Texas, they seem conservative. They passed the transgender bill, but they put loopholes in it. In this case, you can take your kid to Colorado and castrate your kid and bring him back to Texas. So then they can go to the electorate and say, you see how conservative I am? I've passed this conservative bill, vote for me again. And they can go to their donors and say, do you see those awesome loopholes I left? You can give me millions of dollars. That's how the game is played by so-called conservatives in our so-called democratic systems.
Explain to me the federal state response to this, because obviously we've seen Roe versus Wade being put back to the state level by the Supreme Court.
Yes.
Because there's nothing in the Constitution that gives you the right to take the life of a child. So what about the trans issue that's been rolled out? Is whose responsibility? Is there a clash between the federal level and the state level?
There actually isn't. So I finally got one of our members of our legislature to request a formal legal opinion from the Texas Attorney General, Ken Paxton. Ken Paxton is the most successful Attorney General in United States history. He's won more lawsuits against the federal government and has restricted the federal government's encroachment on state rights more than anybody else in American history. He's an amazing person. And he's an incredibly humble person when you meet him. You understand exactly why he's so successful. This opinion, it took him 6 months to write it. It's the longest opinion that's ever been issued from the Texas Attorney General. And what it shows is that in both federal law and Texas state law, it has always been illegal to do this to children. And the reason is, under the United States Constitution, there's a fundamental liberty interest. That means that is the highest level of protection of rights in our law. There's a fundamental liberty interest in procreation. You cannot take a child's ability to procreate any more than you can take a child's ability to speak, to see, to hear, or to eat. So it is a fundamental right of children to procreate. If they become adults, they can make decisions. It could be construed as legal, but it is never legal to sterilize children in the United States or in Texas. They went so far as to even go back. We trace our history in Texas through Spain rather than through England. We fought 3 wars of independence here. So they went back through Spanish juridical law. I mean, it doesn't matter which side you go to, Anglo common law, or you go through Spanish juridical law, all the way back to the earliest days, it's always been illegal to sterilize children. So the fact that it's being done is a massive human rights scandal that I can't believe that Americans sit still for.
It is one of the issues that no one's ever thought that actually this would become an issue. Because I can't imagine 50 years ago, 40 years ago, 30 years ago, of people sitting, we must pass legislation to protect children from this evil. It wasn't on anyone's radar. Is that part of the problem?
Yeah, I mean, who could have contemplated that it would have become, that we would have so-called medical experts saying that we can remove the testicles, healthy testicles from young children. This is just crazy stuff, right? This is the stuff that you read of in the most gruesome, like child murder type stuff. There was no social consensus for this. So that's one of the things that I really learned in this. Well, if you call it a journey, it's been more like a war. Is that our opponents on the left, the secular left, and they're not necessarily far left. This is a secular left thing. They have mastered the art of entryism. Your audience can Google that. They can subvert any democratically run social process. And one of the things that they've perfected is how to manufacture scientific facts. The transgender issue is one of the best illustrations of that. It started with open source journals where like-minded people got together. And they began to look around for marginalized groups. They chose cross-dressers, probably the smallest and most insignificant marginalized group you can imagine. They picked cross-dressers. And then what they do is they began to develop fake scholarship in their open source journal. And what they do is they construct new meta-theories in their own discipline, in this case, psychology. And they develop a fairly sizable little open source journal. Then they eventually convert it to a normal journal in Elsevier, one of the big publishers. And then all of a sudden, they can claim that they have tons of peer-reviewed research to back up their points of view. Then they go into courts as expert witnesses. And they make law in courts because, as you know, under the English common law system that we both inhabit, judges make law through precedent, through the interpretation of law, and it becomes binding on other courts. And they know this. So they go into family courts and they use this fake expertise from these fake journals, and they create law from that. So they've really perfected. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but it's a 6-step process, and they've perfected the manufacturing of scientific facts. It makes perfect sense if you think about it. Science is a social process, and the left has perfected hacking social processes.
Now, you talk about your wife moving to California. There may be some of the audience who aren't aware why and the reasons why that would be. Do you want to just open that up and explain a little bit, which shows the huge disparity and clash between different states?
Yeah, what you're seeing here is part of American federalism, where we actually have states, we don't have provinces. This was understood in the original design of our government to be a bulwark of liberty, because the idea was that you would have people with such different geographical interests that none of them could come together to create a faction to take over the government. That was the idea. Well, we're going to see just how wrong that design has turned out to be here. So California passed a bill. I call it the Transgender Kidnapping Bill. They call it the Transgender Rights Bill, Child Transgender Rights Bill. What it amounts to is any child that enters the borders of California, if they are from a state that has outlawed transgender procedures, California will never return that child to that other state. So that is the basis on which I went up to the Texas Supreme Court to prevent my ex-wife from moving my children to California. And my argument was very simple. It's illegal in Texas. It's a felony in Texas to perform these procedures. In California, it's a right to perform these procedures. Children can actually consent to these procedures at 12 years old in California, okay, without their parents' consent. So I argued at the Texas Supreme Court that this would essentially remove the protections of Texas law for my child and put him into a state that will never return him to the jurisdiction of Texas should the court orders be violated. The Supreme Court of Texas, under the influence of the big donor class, absurdly claimed that my son was under no more danger in California, where this is a affirmative right of being chemically castrated, than he would be in Texas, where it's totally illegal. It's a completely ridiculous ruling. The justice's name that authored the ruling is Justice Blacklock, and the co-author was Justice Young. And these are the leftist morons that we're basically ruled by. So we have a clash in America of values. Now, what's different between California and Texas is this. California is perfectly willing to pass a transgender sanctuary law for kids, right? Texas is completely unwilling to become a sanctuary for children fleeing states where they castrate children. I have tried to push for a law here in Texas to become a sanctuary state for any parent that can that brings their child within the borders of Texas. We will never repatriate that child to a state that castrates kids. Texas will not pass that law because of the liberal donor class in the Republican Party.
So where if a law was passed like that, you would go from the United States to states at war, because if the Texas passed that, then really they would have a duty to go and rescue a child who is going to experience that. This would turn the whole concept of the United States on its head, wouldn't it?
Well, I'm a Texan. So my concept of what American governance is very different than the mainstream concept in America. Let me describe the mainstream concept, and then I'll describe what I think is the correct way, which is, of course, always the Lone Star State way. In the mainstream American way of thinking, the federal government has supremacy over the states, and federal law is always supreme over the states. So what would happen is the case would go into a federal court. Under the full faith and credit doctrine, they would order Texas to return the child because you have to follow the court order. You have to honor the court orders of other states, right? However, under the Texas point of view, there can be no lawful order from the federal government to violate the human rights of any citizen of the United States. In fact, of any person in the United States. So in Texas, we believe in something called nullification. The federal government can tell us what to do all they want, but we don't have to do it. And our question to the federal government is very simple. How many divisions do you have? And you don't have enough divisions to make us do it. And the federal government knows this. So because of that, the federal government has put probably the largest deep state presence in Texas. The largest fusion center in the world is in San Antonio, Texas. It's the largest intelligence fusion center. They control the federal deep state controls elections all the way down to the county level here. They put money into them and make sure that they don't get people elected that want to nullify these federal laws. But there's a huge movement to nullify federal laws in Texas again and to revive the spirit of that. Polls show that over 80% of Texans would support seceding from the United States. And that's no joke. The federal government takes that very seriously because Texas is completely independent. You may not know this, but Texas is on its own power grid. We are not on the American national power grid. We have our own power grid. We have our own army. Texas has its own Air Force, its own army. It even has its own Coast Guard. So we actually could go independent. And they well know that. So yeah, there is ultimately going to be a reckoning in the United States. Europe has typically solved problems like this through expulsion. If you look at its history, you look at the warring periods, in the 17th century, America has typically solved its problems by partition. And that's one of the reasons we have states, not provinces. So I think ultimately the peaceful way forward for America on these social issues is going to be something like this. We're going to have to return to radical federalism, where in Texas, we're just going to have to accept that they're going to castrate children in California. And California is going to have to accept that if you do that in Texas, we're going to give you a lethal injection and execute you.
After the Roe versus Wade, and then with this extreme, crazy individual called Gavin Newsom in California, I wonder where it goes, because if we get President Trump back in the White House, and I've been to 3 different Trump rallies, and always one of the largest cheers has been for the simple phrase that we will not let men into women's bathrooms, and that's a big cheer. But that issue is such a tiny, tiny part. That's maybe easier to discuss because what you're discussing is so much deeper and darker, and it's difficult to go at. But where does where kind of is it moving? Because I've seen a lot of campaigners being much, much more vocal. And I've got to know Billboard Chris, and he was in London recently. Children cannot consent to puberty blockers, and that phrase is regarded as extremist. But where do you kind of see this going with more and more campaigners, individuals? Maybe you've been one of the first, or beginning to highlight this. The message really does have to get through, and this has to be an election issue.
Yeah, it definitely is at the state level. The reason the bathroom issue resonates, it's not just the bathroom issue. It's an emblem of a larger problem in which our elites, our leftist elites that inhabit the agencies of the United States federal government, similar to your Tavistock, have intentionally undermined traditional social norms and have altered the relationship of parents to their children. I mean, think about that. You sire children, and nothing is more important to you than your posterity. And the federal government is using the school system and psychologists and all these things to modify your relationship with your children. So it's really emblematic of that thing. And what I think is really happening with Trump. Look, America has been controlled by financial oligarchs for a long time. I mean, you can go back into the early part of the 20th century. I would argue back to the Gilded Age in the late 1800s. America is completely controlled by plutocrats. So that's not unsurprising. I think everybody would probably see a way to find something to agree with there. What I think has happened is on the West Coast of the United States, and surprisingly in California, in Silicon Valley, a new plutocratic class has arisen. And this class doesn't have left-wing ambitions. It's much more what in America we'd call libertarian ambitions. And it foresees an economy that isn't run by a Federal Reserve, but by peer-to-peer blockchains, and where there's private banking and things like this. So these new elites have realized that they can't achieve any of their commercial vision under the social systems that the left has created for them. And so you see guys like Mark Andreessen, who's a lifelong Democrat, is now supporting Trump. Peter Thiel is supporting Trump. Elon Musk is supporting Trump. And so I think one way to interpret what's happening in America is you have a new class of oligarchs who are rising up to take their place and argue for their interests against the existing oligarchy class. So if I had to sum it up simply, it would be Silicon Valley oligarchs versus Wall Street oligarchs. The Wall Street oligarchs have typically been aligned with America's deep state. And we know that election intelligence services in both of our countries interfere in domestic elections all the time. Well, the problem is the West Coast elites in Silicon Valley have quite wisely embedded themselves into the deep state. So Peter Thiel, for example, runs Palantir, and the deep state needs that software for their terrorist and human targeting systems. And I think this was done intentionally by the West Coast elites in order to make themselves indispensable to the state so they can't be brushed aside. And now that they've gained that power, they're going to begin to exercise. And I think that's why you saw Trump make a big move to Bitcoin. He used to talk it down all the time, and now he doesn't, because he's siding with those West Coast oligarchs. What's happening in America, I think, is essentially you have a war between two social and economic visions among the plutocratic elite.
Can I ask you about, you've obviously, through no choice of your own, been thrown into this dark world of the transgender industry and lobbyists. Where have you seen the catalyst for this? Because there are only a few that will be absolutely ideologically aligned to think, actually, this is normal to do to children. The vast majority won't. Yes. But sadly, just as during COVID, many people do follow blindly to orders and nudging. But is this also an industry that's beginning to build up, that there is money in this? Where kind of have you seen the main catalyst for something which is really madness?
Well, one of the ways you can see that this was planned, that the open source journals I talked about earlier were created, around 2008. You see the Obama administration, long before anybody even knew what this stuff was, and even before gender. It used to be called gender identity disorder, and they reclassified it in the DSM-5, which is our diagnostic manual for psychology, as gender dysphoria. A dysphoria is when you have a perfectly natural human variation, but because of your culture, it causes you psychological difficulty. So it's not a disorder. The Obama administration, before that even happened, forced insurance companies in America to fund transgender surgery, even before it was classified as gender dysphoria. And this created the opportunity for the financial elites in New York, the Wall Street elites that run these insurance companies, to basically financialize this medical procedure. In America, all medicine is financialized and securitized even. In America, if you refuse to take a drug that a doctor prescribes, the doctor will very often fire you as a patient. They will not treat you, because the insurance companies set specific statistical requirements for how many people have to take this drug given this condition. So, and the reason is it's securitized. The insurance company is making financial bets with the drug companies. So everything here is a security, a financial security. So whenever a child walks into a gender clinic in the United States, they become about a $4.5 million lifetime income stream to that gender clinic. Because once they go on cross-sex hormones, they can't get off of it. Lupron, the drug that is mainly used to castrate these children, is the most expensive drug sold in the United States. And and the reason is very simple. The demand for it is skyrocketed. It's only made in one place in the world. So they're making enormous profits. So what they've done is essentially, and this won't be a surprise to my friends in the UK who have been even remotely politically aware for the last 20 years, they have essentially commoditized human misery. And then once it's made a commodity, they securitize it and they make millions of dollars off of it.
Which I've seen in the diabetes drugs, looking at Ozempic. Yes. I think the diabetes industry, health industry is worth over $300 billion. And I only read that this morning. It blew my mind.
Yeah, no doubt about it.
But can I ask you, we've seen, I think, 6 European countries begin to push back on the puberty blockers. Mm-hmm. And the issue is zero long-term studies. And of course, these clinics have been operating on zero data. Mm-hmm. There doesn't seem to be the pushback in the States, despite there being no data. And then how is any medical procedure carried out if there is no data to back it up? Is that still the case in the US, that this has been pushed forward and the wakening up in terms of puberty blockers with no data, that hasn't happened yet in the US?
It hasn't happened, and it's not going to happen. There's a couple of reasons for it. First of all, these uses of, for example, the drug Lupron for puberty blocking, these uses are considered experimental uses. No physician in America is allowed to prescribe an experimental use of a drug to a child, because experimental uses require informed consent. Yeah. That's the first thing. The FDA issued a letter giving special privileges for the use of these puberty blocking drugs for kids, so that they can use experimental uses on children. My representatives at the federal level sent a letter to the FDA asking them why they changed their own ethical guidelines for this one use of a drug. And the FDA wrote a letter back saying that they were going to refuse to respond. Wow. So one of the problems we have in the United States, and I think it's honestly because we copied the UK in the early part of the 20th century. Wilson and FDR wanted an English-style civil service. And we have agencies that run the government. And what I've discovered the hard way with my son, fighting for my son, is that elected officials are not in control of the government. The government is completely run by unelected bureaucrats who are largely captured by the industries that they regulate. So in other words, the government is essentially controlled by the Wall Street plutocrats. And so what you have here is a situation where a big propaganda campaign was initiated by the Paul Singer wing of the plutocracy to make transgender children a kind of liberal shibboleth, a proposition that defines you as a liberal. And liberals are uniquely vulnerable in America to this kind of propaganda. Leftists, the characteristic of the leftist is basically this. They take their opinions not based on facts or reasoning. They take their opinions based on what they think other people will think of them if they have that opinion. And it's what Paul Girard, when he diagnoses the results of envy and what he calls mimesis, where people copy the desires of other people. Leftists are uniquely vulnerable to this. It's a psychological disposition in the leftist mind. And it's exploited heavily in the United States. So it's gone so far at this point that California, for example, has made these transgender procedures enshrined as a right. Let me say that again. Enshrined as a right in their state. It's been made a formal public policy of the state by the legislature, meaning no court can ever overturn it. So it's not going away anytime soon in the United States, no matter what the facts show. And you're right, there have never been facts that show that these procedures are effective. In my 2019 trial, where I won 50-50 custody and no child support, and a check on all medical procedures, and the Texas judges got together and then systematically stripped me of all parental rights instead of giving me 50-50. I brought in a guy named Dr. Levine, who ran the first gender clinic in the 1970s at Johns Hopkins University. And what he testified to is they shut their own clinic down after 4 years because all their data showed they were harming patients. They knew that this stuff was not only not efficacious, they knew that it was harmful back in the 70s. This was done specifically for social purposes. This movement is not being run for the benefit of children or some kind of human right. It's being run because it destroys the traditional family and our traditional notions of sexuality.
Oh, 100%. What has the response from media changed? Have you seen a change in terms of media outlets being willing to engage this, or not really?
Not really. There's a blackout on my case in mainstream media. It's really showed me the importance of independent media like yourself. You have the ability. It's kind of like small theaters. I like live theater. A small theater can take risks that big theaters just can't take, and you'll get the best and most interesting theater at the small theater houses. It's similar with independent media. You can say what you want, you're beholden to no one, and you can address any issue the way you like. That is unfortunately not the case in the mainstream media, even mainstream conservative media. Mm-hmm. So remember, the big donors are liberal, and they fund Fox News. Yeah. They fund all these people. So there's a blackout on my case, and there always will be.
Can we finish on, you mentioned you're a Christian, mm-hmm. And can you let us know kind of how that has affected you? Because I think if an individual goes through this, and if they have no belief in God actually with them through the process, it could be very difficult, not just on this issue, but any issue. How has your faith been important to you, essential to you in this fight?
Well, look, I think that, and I spent most of my life as an atheist, so I'm a convert to Christianity. So for me, this has been a conscious thing. And I think in some sense, it's easier for converts to talk about it because for us, it was a conscious process that we were not born into it. And in some sense,
when did you become a Christian? How long ago?
2004.
Okay.
Yeah. And it creates a way that you can articulate things maybe that people who are born into a Christian culture don't understand. And I also think converts value this because they once didn't have it, and they know what life was. But I think this is very simple. Human suffering has no meaning without God. There's no meaning to human suffering. It's, if I had to describe it so that secular liberals in the UK could grasp this, I would say, imagine a trial, a criminal trial. And let's say Mr. Smith is accused of shooting Mr. Jones. And the prosecutor puts Mr. Smith on the stand. He's in the dock. And he asks him, why did you shoot Mr. Jones? And Mr. Smith says something like this. Well, It all started with pig farmers up in the north of England. And I had bangers and mash, and I had a breakfast. And this, through a long, complicated chemical process, resulted in my brain producing certain kinds of amino acids, which led to electrical, connections in my brain, which ultimately culminated in a twitch of my right finger, which again initiated a complex chain of chemical reactions, which led to a piece of metal being expelled from a tube, which then entered Mr. Jones's body. It interrupted his life processes. Like, that is not what we mean when we say, why did you shoot Mr. Jones? But that is the secular answer, that you're just a bundle of chemicals and, vibrating molecules. And that's the only answer you can give. What we want to know is your motive, your end, your purpose. And ends and purposes are dependent on a transcendent God. There really aren't, without a God, all you're left with is our artificial causes. And you can't ask questions about human motives, right? So similarly with human suffering, if I didn't have a belief in God, if I wasn't a Christian, I'm pretty sure that I wouldn't have been able to endure this peacefully. I remember sitting in a deposition, and a carefully crafted series of questions were being used that were actually developed. I later learned were developed by a psychologist to cause me to act out violently in the deposition. This is the kind of stuff that's been deployed against me. And I'm sitting there calmly reciting the Jesus prayer. And I was able to suffer it simply because I know that there's a transcendent purpose beyond this suffering. My future is probably in a prison because, as I told you, I'm not going to use any of my resources to fund these medical procedures on my children. Well, in the United States, medical expenses are considered child support. And if you don't pay child support, they'll put you in prison. In Texas, it's a state jail felony. So my future is in prison because I'm not going to use any of my resources to hurt my son. How could someone endure suffering like that, or look forward to witnessing that they will stand against injustice like that without a belief in a transcendent purpose? Religion is not some optional thing. I actually think further that the propaganda that has so destroyed Western countries, this leftist propaganda, is only made possible because of a lack of a transcendent worldview. When you strip people of a morality, it turns out that morality, a moral system, is necessary for understanding the physical world. It's because it's very simple. You can't understand human motives without reference to a transcendent purpose. Now, they try to use evolution as a transcendent purpose, right? But that's a purpose which recognizes all sorts of evil things that we all know are wrong. So it doesn't work as a transcendent purpose. And the stripping away of the traditional religious cultures in Europe and America have become the basis for the destruction of everything we see. And the reason I will be able to endure sitting in a prison so that I don't have to harm my son is because I have prayer. I can fast. I can still do good works even in prison. And in the future, I have a future beyond this life that is more important than the one I'm living now.
Jeff, I really do appreciate you sharing your story, and I wholeheartedly agree with you that the West have rejected any concept of truth, and truth is a person. His name is Jesus, and when
That's
you
right.
reject truth, absolute truth, you reject Christ, and into that vacuum comes anything and everything, and that's why we've seen the collapse of societies all across the West. Jeff, thank you so much. I'd encourage people to go and sign. There was a little quote from one of your sections on your Substack, and it was, "Don't stand on the train tracks of history yelling, 'Stop at the rushing locomotive and modernity. Hijack the damn thing and take over. Subscribe.'" And I'll leave that with our viewers, that I know they will have been really interested in your story, and I know that people will want to go and look at your Substack, jeffyounger.substack.com. Make sure and click on it. Follow Jeff if you aren't already doing so, and do consider subscribing. So, Jeff, thank you for giving us your time today.
Thank you, Peter. It's been wonderful talking to you.